Hello again. In this video, we're going to go over section 3.5, which is about the derivatives of the trig functions. And you may remember in the last video, we introduced the derivative of the 6 trig functions shown in this theorem 312. And so you may remember the derivative of sine of x is cosine of x, and derivative of cosine of x is actually minus sine of x. Derivative of tangent is secant squared. Derivative of cotangent is minus cosecant squared. The derivative of secant of x is secant of x tangent of x, and the derivative of cosecant of x is minus cosecant of x times the cotangent of x. And so what I want to do in this video is just do some examples where we use some of these derivatives. Okay, so let's take this first example. Here we want to find the derivative of sine of x minus x times cosine of x. Now, of course, you can break up this across subtraction. Okay, so we can find the derivative of the sine of x and then subtract the derivative of x times cosine of x. Okay, now the derivative of sine of x, of course, is just cosine of x. But in order to find this derivative, we're going to have to use the product rule, because x is the first function and cosine of x is the second function. Okay, and so the product rule says take the first and multiply it by the derivative of the second function, and the derivative of cosine is minus sine. And then you add that to the second function, which is cosine of x, and then multiply that by the derivative of the first function, which of course the derivative of that first function is just 1. Okay, and then we're going to subtract this entire derivative. So I've got to put that in parentheses and subtract it off. Okay, and now let's just distribute that minus sign. Okay, so this is going to become a plus x times sine of x, and then this will become a minus cosine of x. And of course, the cosine of x's cancel, and you're left with x times sine of x. Okay, so that's the derivative of this function here. Okay, so let's try this one. So if we're going to find the derivative of this function, we probably need to use the quotient rule. So the quotient rule says take the low and multiply it by the derivative of the high, minus the high times the derivative of the low, all divided by low times low. Okay, so the low function would be 1 minus sine of x. Okay, so low and then times the derivative of the high. So we've got to find the derivative of this function. Okay, and I'm just going to write that out for now, and we'll find it in a moment. All right, so low derivative of high minus high. The high function is this one. And then the derivative of the low, which is this one. All over low times low. Okay, so now let's go through and find these derivatives. Now, to find this derivative, you can break this up across addition and take the derivative of the first one and add it to the derivative of the second one. Of course, the derivative of the first one here would just be 0 because it's a constant. Okay, so we get 1 minus sine of x, and then 0 plus whatever the derivative of sine of x is. Okay, which the derivative of sine of x is cosine of x. Okay, minus 1 plus sine of x times the derivative of this. And again, we can break this up across subtraction. And the derivative of the first one is 0 because it's a constant. Okay, so we get 0 and then minus the derivative of sine of x, which of course is cosine of x. All over this. Okay, and I'm just going to write that as 1 minus sine of x squared. Those are the same thing. Okay, And so let's just try and simplify this. Now this cosine of x can be distributed to both pieces here. Okay, so you get cosine of x and then minus cosine times sine, or sine times cosine, whatever order you want to write that in. And then distribute this. Actually, what I'm going to do here, probably the best thing to do here is you're subtracting off this minus cosine. So what you can do, right, this is just minus cosine. And what you can do is you can move this in front. You can change the order of multiplication, right? It doesn't matter. So I'm going to move that in front, just changing the order of my multiplication. And then the minus and the minus here will give me a plus. Okay, and now I can distribute the cosine to both of these. Okay, so you end up with cosine x plus cosine times sine. And you can write that in any order you want, and I'm going to write it as sine and then times cosine. Oh, I'm running out of space here. Okay, and then that's all over 1 minus sine squared. Okay, so then notice that these do cancel out. You have minus sine of x times cosine of x, which cancels with this plus sine of x cosine of x. So those cancel out. And then you're left with 2 cosine of x on top, all over 1 minus sine x squared. Okay, and if you want, you maybe, you could FOIL this out at the bottom, but I don't think it's going to help us because there's nothing here that's going to cancel with the cosine on the top. Okay, so this is about as simple as it's going to get. I don't think you can simplify this any further. Okay, so that's the derivative of 1 plus sine of x divided by 1 minus sine of x. Okay, so let's look at one more. Okay, so here we're taking the derivative of secant of x times cosecant of x. Okay, and just as a reminder, the derivative of secant of x is secant times tangent of x, so we're going to need that at some point. And the derivative of cosecant of x is minus cosecant of x times cotangent of x. So keep that in mind. Okay. All right. So, but in order to find this derivative, we're going to have to use the product rule. Okay. So let's take the first function and multiply it by the derivative of the second function. And then plus the second function times the derivative of the first function. Okay. So we have secant of x and then the derivative of cosecant, which is minus cosecant cotangent, plus the cosecant of x times the derivative of secant, which is secant times tangent. Let me just pull that up again. So the derivative of secant is secant times tangent. Okay, and so let's see if we can't simplify this. Of course, this minus sign can come out front. Okay, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to write everything in terms of sine and cosine and see if we can get to if we can simplify this in any way. So I'm going to pull this minus sign out in front, and then secant is 1 over cosine. Okay, and then cosecant is 1 over sine. And then cotangent is actually cosine divided by sine. Okay, again, cosecant is 1 over sine. Secant is 1 over cosine. And then tangent is sine over cosine. Okay, this is a very common technique. When you have trig functions and you want to simplify them, one thing you can do is to try to turn everything into sines and cosines. Okay, let's see what we get out of this. So notice these cosines cancel. You have cosine of x divided by cosine of x, so those certainly cancel out. And it looks like this leaves you with a minus 1 over sine squared of x. And then over here, the sine of x cancels here with that sine of x. And it appears to you're left with a cosine squared in the denominator, so 1 over cosine squared. Okay, and you're adding those. Okay, but then you can write this 1 over sine of x is cosecant of x. And just to be clear, you may want to write it like this first. 1 over sine squared is the same as this. After all, when you square this, it means multiply it by itself. And then when you multiply these together, you get 1 and then divided by sine squared. Okay. And the reason you may want to write it like that is because then it makes it clear 1 over sine is cosecant. Okay, and I'm going to do the same thing with this one. That's just 1 over cosine squared. And of course, 1 over cosine is secant. Okay. All right, so that just leaves us with this is cosecant and then squared. So I'm going to write that like this, and it happens to have a minus sign in front of it. And this is secant squared, and we're adding it. And maybe just to make it a little bit nicer, we'll just write it as secant squared minus cosecant squared. Okay, so the derivative of secant of x times cosecant of x using the product rule turns out to be secant squared of x minus cosecant squared of x. Okay, so I hope you found this video helpful. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.